God, I hope I'm just going crazy. You ever have one of those how in the hell did I get here moments? I mean those flashes of clarity where you really see your life. You look in the mirror and you're so far removed from the person you dreamed of being when you were a kid that you're stunned speechless. Mine happened about a year ago, a week or two before Thanksgiving, when I woke up in the hospital. I was incredibly disoriented. Everything seemed unreal and distant, not really happening to me. Like I was dreaming, or an avatar in a video game. Maybe it was because I already felt so disconnected. Maybe it was the terrifying reminder of my own mortality. But it felt like I was seeing myself with a stranger's eyes. Waves of shame and self-hatred rolled over me in that hospital bed, and I vowed to change my life. I'd made similar resolutions before and failed miserably, but this time was different. This time, the change was nearly effortless. Old habits evaporated, old temptations lost all allure. Peer pressure stopped being an issue because I just wasn't interested in hanging out with my usual group. And when I tried going out with them sober, they bored me to tears. Meanwhile, other relationships in my life were improving. At my son Logan's birthday party, I even overheard my ex-wife telling her mother that I'd finally grown up and stopped causing so much heartache for everyone. When the last children had left and I was cleaning up, my son surprised me with a running hug. He wrapped his arms around me and squeezed me harder than he ever had in his life. "Will you stay?" he whispered. I brushed back his hair with my hand. "Of course! I'll stay as long as you want. You could even spend the night at my place tonight, if your mother says it's okay." He sighed happily. "You're so much better than my real dad." Every cell in my body froze. I launched into a speech about how I was his dad, was trying to change, and knew I needed to earn his trust back. "Okay," he said lightly, obviously eager to return to his pile of presents. But just before he ran off, he winked at me, like we had an awesome secret. Logan couldn't stay with me that night after all, and honestly, I was kind of relieved. What he had said had cut me to the core, and for the first time in nearly a year, I desperately wanted a drink. I made it all the way to the front door of my apartment complex before I lost it and started sobbing. I was fumbling in my pocket for my keys, trying to see through a glaze of tears, when Sam put her hand on my shoulder. Sam had lived in the apartment next door to mine for years. Before my epiphany, I'd barely spared her a glance. But after, I found myself choking on cartoon butterflies whenever she passed by. I had never had to chase a girl before. It's not like I'm Brad Pitt or anything. It's just that I used to spend an enormous amount of time and money making myself look nothing like myself. If you had seen the old me, or one of my countless clones, a golem of silicone and acrylic, spray tan and bleach. It was a lot like being a zombie, I suppose. You can barely move for fear that parts of you will fall off. Back on point, I'd been trying to catch Sam's eye for months, and I was terrible at it. I'd chat her up and think I was getting somewhere, but then I'd make a joke or quote a movie, and she'd cringe like I'd just stabbed her. It was a humiliating way to have finally caught her attention. Bawling like an angry toddler on the front steps, miserably wiping snot on my sleeve as I blubbered confessions for a million sins. Sam listened patiently, only stopping me once to suggest we get out of the cold and continue talking in her apartment. She drank me under the table. I'd lost all my tolerance in a year of sobriety, But Sam definitely didn't have that problem. When I got up to get us both another, it was easy to see why. Her refrigerator looked like mine used to, boasting the 4 food groups of beer, liquor, takeout, and antique condiments. "Did your roommate move out?" I asked, carrying our beers back from the kitchen. "He was a big cook, right? I used to walk by your place around dinner time and drool." "He wasn't my roommate," she said quietly. "He was my husband." My face fell, and the last year flashed by in sickening instant replay. Her total disinterest in me, followed by the pained looks and vanishing act whenever she caught herself flirting back. I'd never bothered to ring check her until my crush hit. "If you'd like to talk about it, I'm interested. But I won't pry if you don't. It's up to you." She laughed a little, shaking her head. "It's funny. Stanley was usually such a good judge of character, but he was so wrong about you. Sucks that he never got to know you. I think he really would have liked you." She changed the subject, and I excused myself soon after. The next day, curiosity led me to Google her husband. As I read through the result, my eyes widened. Stanley had died the night I'd passed out, and it appeared that he might have accidentally saved my life. I spoke with a neighbor and confirmed that my guess was right. The EMTs who responded to Sam's 911 call had been the ones who had found me. Since they had been called out for just one patient and only had one ambulance, they'd put me on a board and hung it on hooks from the ambulance ceiling. I didn't sleep a wink the night I found that out. My stupid drunk ass had hung there a few feet above the worst moments of Sam's life, and the last ones of Stanley's. The ultimate third wheel, intruding on something incredibly private and intimate. I laid in my bed, staring at the ceiling, imagining what it must have been like for Stanley, staring up at a man he'd thought was a total waste, knowing that I would wake up, and he never would. I blushed against my pillow, thinking of how I'd hit on her so soon after his death. I couldn't believe she'd end up comforting me. I swore to never flirt with Sam again, and I kept that promise, even as we became friendlier and wound up with a weekly TV and Chinese food appointment. I didn't mean to get her a Christmas present. I'd considered it, but wrote it off as over the line. Then I went thrifting and saw this pocket knife. It wasn't anything flashy, but something about it just said Sam to me. When I picked it up and examined it, the owner came up behind me. "You've got nice taste," he said. "They don't make 'em like that anymore." And I smiled, 'cause that's how I felt about Sam. But when Sam opened the gift, her face went white. Did I tell you about this that night I was so drunk?" she murmured, picking up the knife and turning it in her fingers. "I must have." Sam had inherited one exactly like it from her grandfather. It had gotten lost when she and Stanley moved into the building, and she felt awful about it. "Oh, crap. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to bring up bad memories." No, this is great. I've been trying to find one like it for a long time. Thank you." I think she meant to peck me on the cheek, but it landed on the corner of my mouth. And the next thing I knew, she was kissing me for real. It was amazing for about 10 seconds, and then she sprang off the couch, stammering that she was sorry, that she'd been overcome, and then it just poured out of her. She told me how much I reminded her of Stanley, how being with me was so much like being with him that it broke her heart. "You say things he said. You quote movies he used to quote. Jesus, you wear some of the same clothes. Who puts this green shit on Triscuits? Nobody I've ever met. Except you. And him. I didn't reply. I couldn't reply. I shouldn't have kissed you. My therapist said. She broke off with a disgusted noise, sighing deeply before continuing. I just don't think I can get over him and do this. The dinners with you, I'm not moving on. I'm just pretending I don't have to. She apologized again, and then she was gone. I stared up at the door like an idiot for a few seconds, letting that sink in. She left her present on my coffee table, and I bent to pick it up. You're so much better than my real dad. Suddenly, pieces were snapping together in my mind, and I kept shaking my head like I could break them apart again. What I was thinking was stupid, crazy, superstitious lunacy. I had been a few feet away in the ambulance when he had died. I had woken up consumed with self-loathing, turning into a new person almost overnight. One with different hobbies, different opinions, different tastes. Even my own son didn't believe I was me. So many things falling into place. My instant extra strength crush on Sam, my new clothing and hairstyle, so similar to his in his Facebook photos. How I'd suddenly decided to take up cooking and been weirdly good at it. How I'd never put mint jelly on Triscuits before and had no idea why I'd even bought it. How I didn't remember seeing half the movies I was always quoting. I've started seeing a therapist myself. She says I'm trying to distance myself from a past I'm ashamed of. That low self-esteem and my crush on Sam have manifested in me imagining that I'm a person that she could love. She thinks maybe I hit my head when I fell, or maybe I have something called depersonalization disorder. I've read countless stories on here about hauntings and possessions. I mean, you guys are the experts on banishment and rituals. But what do I do if I'm the ghost? I sent the text to my friend Max, reading, "Dude, are you at school?" The bus was already a good 20 minutes late. It was late November, and it was cold. So damn cold. My eyes burned against the outside air, and each intake of breath was like swallowing razor blades. Everything was dim, tinted a dull blue, and all was eerily still, seemingly frozen in time. The mercury in the thermometers had settled to the bottom, refusing to budge. I could see my breath as it shimmered against the thin air, warping and climbing upwards in despair before vanishing. Even the trees, long dead, with crooked, empty limbs, appeared to be shaking against the cold. Frost and ice glinted sharply in the faded sunlight, clinging on and threatening to overtake the trees. The occasional glimmer of sunlight was nothing short of an ironic and cruel sight, as the warmth could not be felt. The occasional glimmer of sunlight was nothing short of an ironic and cruel sight, as its warmth could not be felt. It seemed so distant, its hazy blue glow so utterly small and insignificant against the frozen vastness. The crunch of snow could be heard as I walked, a crisp, sharp sound cutting through what was otherwise dead silence, before disappearing into the oblivion with nothing to return an echo. I stopped for a minute. It seemed as if I was the only one in this world. A world of cold, of stillness, of nothingness. Neither the heat of a friend nor the joy of their company existed here. I was taking a note of all this with my eyes closed, so as to keep them from freezing, when I began to hear the crunching of snow. It was Sarah. I always met her at the bus stop, or had been anyway, for the past 2 weeks. I was glad of it too. I used to hang out with my good friend Jenna, but she hadn't been showing up for the past week or so, and now it was just Sarah to keep me company. I opened my eyes slowly, wincing at the frosty wind. I could see Sarah walking towards me, paced slow and steady. Her balance wasn't affected in the slightest by the now increasing gusts of frigid air whipping snowflakes around like small needles. She wore a fuzzy wool purple hat that sat lazily atop her head. It didn't obscure her face at all, however, and I could still see her eyes of the purest blue you could imagine. They were only highlighted by her flushed red cheeks, no doubt due to the cold. She was absolutely beautiful. Sweet and funny too. But for some reason, I never really saw her with any friends. I suppose this was because she had just moved in. That, and because all the guys I knew were too afraid to even talk to her. I guess that's why she stuck with me all the time. In fact, she actually seemed incredibly lonely when I wasn't with her. I suddenly snapped out of my thoughts to realize that I was staring at her. She saw me looking and gave a slight giggle with an exaggerated wave. I quickly blushed and only managed to choke out an awkward, "Hey," before turning away. I quickly whirled back around, however, as I realized something was wrong. She was wearing nothing but a t-shirt, a pair of short shorts, and her backpack. I practically tripped over myself as I ran to her. "Sarah, what are you doing?" I cried. She stood in front of me, shivering and taking short, staggered breaths. Her attire was certainly strange, but there was something else wrong too. Something was different about her. "Did you walk all the way here like this?" I asked, dumbfounded. She had said earlier that her house was a good 20-minute walk from the bus stop. "John is worrying about me?" she cried, her face lighting up as her eyes widened and stared straight into mine. She paused for a moment before sheepishly continuing. "I thought maybe I could use your coat?" Her voice trailed off as she looked down at the ground. I couldn't believe it. I had on several layers of jackets and I was still freezing. I couldn't even imagine how cold she must have been. "Oh my God, Sarah, of course," I said, taking off layer after layer and wrapping her in them. "Did you not have enough time to grab a jacket?" I asked incredulously, now down to just a t-shirt myself. "You must be freezing, and the bus is already late. You had plenty of time." She shook her head. "I wanted to use yours," she giggled, wrapping her arms around herself in the jacket she was now wearing, smiling with eyes closed. I was completely taken aback. This wasn't like her at all. I stammered. "You did this on purpose?" "I've never felt so close to you," she smiled, leaning her head on my shoulder. My mind was racing. I had no idea what to say to that. "Sarah, why are you acting so strange all of a sudden?" I asked. She didn't respond at first, and didn't seem to have heard my question. "Aw, won't you be cold now?" she suddenly asked, forcefully grabbing my hands in hers. My mouth moved, but words were nowhere to be found. It's okay. I'll just freeze to death," I finally joked, as I often do when I'm uncomfortable. Her face erupted in horror, her eyes growing wider than I'd ever seen. "No!" she screamed in anguish, beginning to unzip my jackets, meaning to give them back. "No, I was joking," I cried, grabbing her arms to stop her. The instant my hands closed around her, her face flushed bright red and she stopped in her tracks. "John," she stammered. "You need them more than I do," I laughed awkwardly. sickening concern encroaching on my heart. Her face changed then, distorting, twisting, and giving me the widest smile I had ever seen. I found myself backing up and letting go of her arms. Her smile was misplaced somehow, erroneous and deranged. It crawled across her face like a disease and just kept spreading. Her eyes didn't blink and stared straight towards me but weren't really focused on anything. The areas in which they'd normally seem to sparkle now seemed dull and flat. It was incredibly disturbing, so much so that I began to sweat despite the cold. "So, are you ready for school?" I asked nervously, trying desperately to change the subject or do anything to get rid of that smile. "School?" she questioned, straight-faced, and her eyes slowly coming back to focus. "We don't have school today, silly. It's a snow day because of the storm that's coming," she giggled. "What?" I cried. "Gosh dang it, I didn't get an email or anything." She said nothing, but looked at the ground guiltily. Then I saw it. A smile began to slowly carve out her cheeks. I was dumbfounded. Did you?" I started. "I wouldn't have been able to see you if you knew there was no school," she said matter-of-factly, as that twisted grin continued to stretch her face further and further, eating away at her pale skin. The wind howled, and crystalline needles bit at my exposed skin. Suddenly, she laughed, grabbing onto my waist. "You better stay close," she giggled. "Otherwise, you'll catch a cold." My mind was in full retreat mode now as I began backing up. I tried to wiggle free of her grasp, saying, "Yeah, I guess. I think I'll go home now and maybe get some more coats. I guess I'll see you tomorrow then if the weather improves. Okay?" Seemingly not hearing me, she snuggled in closer and closed her eyes. My hands were in the air, my body rigid and taut as my heart convulsed with unease. I drew several shaky breaths and looked down at her. Her smile now appeared, well, rather peaceful. Is this really all that bad? I thought to myself. A lot of guys I know would do anything to be in this position. She just wanted to see me was all. Yeah, it's actually really sweet, albeit a little drastic. I relaxed a little, almost hugging her back, when suddenly I saw the dark crimson stains on her arms. My muscles tensed. I choked, my voice faltering as I stammered. "Is that blood?" Ignoring the question, she pressed herself even closer and looked up at me. "Let's go to your house," she squealed, her face like a child's on Christmas. "Don't you need your coats? I'll take them for you." She grabbed my hand, looking at me to lead the way. Her big blue eyes glimmered with hope. I felt sick, torn between concern and fear. But surely she was just having an off day, or messing with me in a cruel, drawn-out joke. It didn't really matter, though. We can't stay out here forever, I thought to myself. Taking a deep breath, I slowly nodded my head and began walking towards my house. She clung to me tightly as we walked, and I tried desperately not to shiver and send her on another episode. We were nearly to my driveway when I got a text back from Max. I awkwardly wiggled my phone out of my pocket with my left hand, as my right was still in Sarah's vice grip. I was still walking as I brought the phone up when I was suddenly jerked back, almost losing my balance on the slick ice. I turned around to see that Sarah had stopped cold. Her hands grasped so tight around my own that I could almost hear bones breaking. I let out a gasp of pain and tried to pull my hand free, but she wouldn't allow it. Her expression had gone dark, hair draping over her face. "Who's that?" she said, the usual cheer all but gone from her voice. It's Max, my friend," I gasped, still cringing in pain as I opened the message from him. "He was just telling me about..." My blood froze. I stared at the screen as my chest tightened. Telling you what? Her voice cut through the crisp air. Just about how much he likes snow. I lied. Slowly, her cute face reappeared, and her grip lightened as she smiled at me. We began walking again. You know, I like snow too, she said coyly. I didn't even hear her. I was too busy staring at what was on the screen. It read, "Yeah, of course I'm at school. Where the hell are you?" I turned to look at Sarah, my hands beginning to shake, having nothing to do with the cold. I'm sure my face showed my horror and confusion, but if she saw, she didn't let on as she met my gaze with a cutesy smile. Her murky black hair was partially obscuring her left eye, making the right seem all the more piercing as its frozen blue hue searched my face. I could feel its chilling gaze stabbing at my numb skin. "Who would you rather hang out with?" she said, still a hint of malice in her quiet voice. "What?" I stammered. "Max. Is he a good friend of yours?" she said, looking away. Yeah, I guess," I replied nervously. "I mean, I've known him for a while." Her hands slowly balled into tight fists, nearly crushing my own hand as she muttered something under her breath. Then she turned into my driveway and started walking down, leading me. How did she know where to turn? How did she know this was my driveway? I yanked my hand from hers with all of my might and took a few steps back. "Sarah," I said, trying to keep my voice strong, "where is the bus?" She looked devastated, staring at her empty hand, not saying a word. Her irises shook slightly, her face becoming hollow. Whatever color she had disintegrated into a gray slag. "Where the hell is the bus, Sarah?" I yelled. "Why didn't it ever come?" She looked up at me. "No school today," she muttered to herself, eyes once again distant and dim as she fumbled around and tried to reach for my hands blindly. "Yes, we do, Sarah. We do have school," I cried, further cracking up. "The bus should have been at the stop, but it never came." "It wanted just the two of us," she mumbled, face blank and emotionless. "And why do you have your backpack if you weren't planning on going to school? How do you know where I live?" I was becoming hysterical now. She chose to ignore all of this and instead found my hands again, gripping them tightly and smiling crookedly. In the most unnatural way, she didn't seem to be feeling emotions, and yet carved them into her own face all the same. It was as if she was trying to imitate expressions she had seen others express. "I'm cold," she said. "We should go inside." I took a few long breaths and tried to calm myself down. It must have been a misunderstanding. Max was probably just messing with me. It wouldn't be unlike him to joke around like that and get me all worked up about a missing school day that didn't exist. He was the one lying, and I had lashed out at Sarah, who was just trying to be nice. Right? I'm not even sure if I believed it myself, but it was better than thinking of the alternatives. "I'm sorry," I sighed, then fumbling for words to make her feel better, I choked out, "Thanks. Thanks for being with me." My heart warmed as I saw her face shift ever so slightly. As if waking from a dream, her eyes glanced around, taking in her surroundings for the first time. Her sunken, lifeless features slowly ebbed away, as, for the first time today, a believable smile flickered into view. One that didn't appear focused or fueled by delusions. When her eyes cleared, focused on me, and realized that I was smiling back, she blushed profusely and turned away. I laughed at that, and she started to giggle too. Her eyes suddenly flicked down to her hands, which were still gripping mine. She let out a little squeal and dropped them, burying her face in her palms, apologizing over and over. Her black hair meandered around aimlessly in the wind, doing little to hide her embarrassed face. This was the Sarah I knew. The girl who had trouble talking to other people. The girl who always had a bewildered look about her, as if the world was shifting under her feet. The girl who hadn't been able to look me in the eye for several days when we first met. She never talked about herself. She didn't seem to want to. She would always listen though. And when she did, her eyes always seemed less piercing, less haunted, and I was certain that she could sit silently for hours while I spoke. Before the events of today, I had still known something was off about her, about the way she listened so devotedly. I could always see a faint emotion shift her features, but it was now finally clear what I had been looking at. Relief. When she listened, she appeared relieved, so incredibly comforted to be free of her own thoughts. It was absolutely heart-wrenching, but it also served to make her previous demeanor of a few minutes ago all the more out of place. She hadn't listened at all. She appeared to be trapped in her own mind. As we began walking down the driveway to my house, I looked at her and took a heavy breath, calming my nerves. I only hoped that her strange behavior had subsided for good. We trudged through the slowly accumulating snow. I had been too lazy to shovel it with my parents having left for Hawaii a week ago. Ironically, as much as it pissed me off to imagine them on a beach while I was stuck here, I was actually glad that neither of them would be home for a few days, so I wouldn't have to explain Sarah to them. It would just be all too like them to try and make things weird if I brought a girl over. We reached the door and I fumbled for my key, eventually unlocking the door and jumping inside before too much warm air escaped into the bitter cold. I immediately started up a fire, not really realizing how cold I had been until that moment. I looked over at Sarah, who was taking off the jackets and folding them neatly before placing them down gingerly by the entrance. Her movements were strained, her spindly limbs tired and weak. She appeared to have a normal mental state now, but as she finished up and her eyes glanced at me, I couldn't help but tense a little. "Hey, Sarah?" I asked slowly, my heart going dark and beginning to pound, distrust and fear suddenly reclaiming me. I had to know. I nervously continued. "Could you maybe go to my room and get me a hoodie?" My pulse was racing and my breath quickened. If she could. "Anything for John," she cried with a big smile, turning to go. She took several steps further into the house. Her pale form walked deliberately at first, but her pace gradually devolved into a strange staggering motion before she eventually came to a complete halt. Still facing away from me, her icy voice quietly seeped out. "But I don't know where your room is." I felt a huge wave of relief. Thank God. I felt bad for ever doubting her, for giving her such a dumb test. I laughed. "Sorry, that's right. It's up the..." I suddenly stopped myself. You know what? I'll just go get it. I need to stop being so lazy anyway. What was wrong with me? I apparently still felt like I couldn't trust her. Stupid. But I just couldn't stop myself. I didn't believe her. I wanted to know if there really was no school. I wanted to know why she had been acting so strange. The only thing holding me back was the fear of such a question bringing back that other smile, that deranged face. So I just kept quiet, instead asking her if she wanted some hot chocolate. Her eyes lit up. "Is that even a question?" She laughed. Her ghoulish posture slackened slightly as she turned to face me. I smiled and moved into the kitchen, starting a pot of water to boil. "Would you mind watching this for a second?" I asked. "Don't you worry," she joked. "No one watches water better than me." I laughed and ran up the stairs to my room. I grabbed my doorknob only to recoil in shock. It was freezing. I could feel a draft of frozen air seeping out from under my door. I gingerly grabbed the handle with my fingertips and slowly opened it, letting loose a blast of frigid air. It felt like a window had been left open, but as I checked, they were all closed. Now that I thought about it, I remembered my room being freezing that morning as well, and really quite drafty for the past week or so. I was only really noticing it now that today was so particularly cold. I would probably have to sleep downstairs by the fire until I could figure out the problem. I quickly grabbed my hoodie and closed the door to my room so I wouldn't let all of the heat out of the house. I walked back down the stairs and into the kitchen, but Sarah was gone. The pot was boiling over, spilling water onto the floor. I quickly ran and shut off the heat, cursing under my breath as some of the scalding liquid splashed onto me. I grabbed some towels and began soaking up the mess. I finally got it all cleaned up when I thought I could hear shuffling on the kitchen floor. "Oh no, John!" Sarah suddenly cried from directly behind me, making me jump out of my skin. I whirled around to face her. She was holding her backpack, seemingly empty now as she slung it back over her shoulder. "What were you doing?" I asked, my eyes narrowing. As soon as I said it, I immediately regretted doing so. I began to see her eyes frost over as she searched for an answer, her face becoming sunken, lifeless, her personality flipping. "No, it's all right," I cried desperately, handing a mug to her. Do you want marshmallows? Look, I have cute little bunny-shaped ones." This snapped her out of it, and she squealed into light as I showed her the bag. "Look at the sugary little mammals," she giggled. I forced a laugh as I started to make the hot chocolate. I was so torn and confused. I really liked her like this, but where had that other side of her come from? It scared the shit out of me. I had to watch everything I said and did to keep her as the Sarah I knew. Or thought I knew anyway. It was about noon now. The school would have called by now to report me absent if there had been a school day. I thought to myself. I let myself relax a little more, looking over at Sarah as she sipped delicately on her hot chocolate. Her hat was still goofily perched on her head. I smiled and reached over the table to her, adjusting it so that it was at least sitting straight. "There," I said, sitting back down and grinning. "That's better." She stared wide-eyed back at me, her cheeks going red, trying in vain to keep from smiling. Suddenly, from within her backpack, her phone rang. I couldn't help but facepalm as I heard the ringtone. "Bruno Mars?" I laughed as her face broke out in horror. "You're just as bad as my mom," I continued. "I can't believe you two have the same ringtone." She practically squealed in embarrassment and fished around in her backpack, quickly tearing out the battery. She sheepishly put the battery in her pocket and looked down at her feet. "Do you want to," she asked nervously, "maybe walk to the bus stop with me tomorrow?" "Trying to change the subject, eh?" I playfully jeered. Her face just grew even redder as her hands fumbled hastily with her shirt. I couldn't help myself. It was impossible to say no to her like this. Any fears from before were buried deep in the back of my mind. My giggles slowly died out, and I gave a slight nod, saying, "Yeah, sure." "Great!" she cried, suddenly bolting out of her chair and running to the door. "I've, got to go do something now. I'll be here tomorrow at 6. She called back as she disappeared into the frozen wasteland, shutting the door behind her. I sat stunned for a good minute. Where the hell did that come from? She hadn't even taken a coat with her. Imagining her in just a t-shirt in that brutal cold made me want to run after her, but I knew she was long gone at that point. I lazed around for a few hours, did some chemistry homework, and even shot Max another text saying, "I'm serious, man. We didn't have school today, right? But he never got back to me. He rarely checked his phone anyway, though, so I brushed it off, opting to sit and watch TV rather than simply wait for his lazy ass to reply. I was absent-mindedly watching some sort of documentary when my phone finally buzzed. Picking it up, I realized that it had just run out of batteries. Max still hadn't responded. Groaning, I stood up and picked up my house phone. I would just have to call him at home. I punched in his number and brought the phone to my ear. Dial tone. I tried again. Dial tone. Frustrated, I looked at the monitor. No service, it read. What? It's a landline. How is that even possible? I grumbled to myself. Must have something to do with the storm. I sighed and tossed the phone, plopping back down onto the couch. I realized that I should have been checking the news to see if they had any insight to the possibility of school tomorrow. I flipped to the channel, and my heart practically stopped. I only heard the tail end, not releasing images or further details on the bus incident. Then the camera switched and they began talking about the highway conditions. I felt an absolutely horrible sickness gripping me. It couldn't be, could it? Surely that little dialogue I heard couldn't have been talking about that. Not about the bus on my route. That would be ridiculous. I'm not even sure what I heard. I tried in vain to calm myself down, but I quickly realized that I had to know for sure. A strong wind suddenly gusted outside, and the house shook, tremors being sent down every dark hallway. I stood up from my couch slowly, glancing at the snow beginning to plaster against the windows. Although gray and dull, the flakes seemed to glow against the oppressive darkness as nighttime fell. The frozen slag piled up, as distortive structures slowly spread across the once perfectly clear glass. I secured every layer I could find and suited up, grabbing my flashlight and taking several deep breaths. The frigid night air seemed to ripple with heat distortion as the door swung open, falling stagnant as I stepped outside. I locked the door behind me and fumbled the keys into my pocket with shaking hands. I began walking the route my bus would have taken, my pace slow, the sickness growing worse with every crunch of snow under my feet. The school didn't report me absent. Well, that's because my phone is dead. Max was just playing a joke. Well, then why didn't he ever text me back? Nothing I said to myself made me feel any better. The dim light from my house was becoming more and more distant now, disappearing altogether as I turned a corner. Now just me and the flurry of snow. The skeletal trees surrounding me groaned against the wind, their twisted black shapes silhouetted against the deep blue hue of the night. I hadn't seen another house for some time now. The families in my neighborhood were exceedingly spread apart, and the empty stretches of road seemed to snake on forever at points. The families in my neighborhood were exceedingly spread apart, and the empty stretches of road seemed to snake on forever at points. More often than not, the snowplows didn't even find the time to drive as deep into the community as I was going. It was snowing quite heavily, but I was still certain that I would be able to faintly see the tracks of the bus if it had driven anywhere. Despite this, I hadn't seen tracks for over a mile. Ordinary cars never usually drove up the way I was walking, and yet I noticed the roadway was layered with the tracks of smaller vehicles. They looked fresh. And that's when I saw something up ahead, barely visible in the haze. Lights, flashing red and blue just around the next bend. Whatever sanity I had left was quickly draining. I approached the lights and peeked around the corner. I didn't want to believe it, but the sight that greeted me was something I had known I would find all along. There, surrounded by ambulances and police cars, a mangled mess of metal and shattered glass, sat the bus I had been taking for nearly 4 years, jutting sideways out of a ditch. The windows were caked with blood, which was still a dark crimson red, preserved perfectly in the cold. The once hot, steaming liquid had frozen solid to the splintered glass, encircling small bullet-sized holes. The ambulances were stuffed with body bags, as the surrounding street was scattered with a few severed limbs. I swore I could see steam softly rising from the dead white appendages, as they were ever so slowly covered in drifting snow. I tried to listen to what the officers were saying, but not daring to get too close, I could only make out a few words and jumbled phrases. Hacksaw, removed post-mortem, and the one that made my stomach churn. A few pieces missing. Realizing how downright suspicious I looked, I began sprinting back to my house, trying to keep my stomach down as my heart lurched rapidly. I reached my front door and frantically fumbled for the key with my numb fingers, looking behind me into the inky darkness. I finally got the key in the lock and turned it, but I heard a sound, a knock on glass. It was coming from above me. I looked up slowly, heart pounding. There, in the window above me, the window to my room, I couldn't see much of anything. The light was off. Which was a problem, because I knew I had left it on. But then, I could make out some sort of shadowy smudge on the window. I was straining to see what it was, when it suddenly moved, backing away into the darkness, and it was only when this happened that I knew what I had been looking at. Sarah's pale, ghastly form had been pressed up against the glass, smiling down at me with a grin that splintered her face in half. The realization made me stumble back, fear negating my ability to breathe for a second. How the hell did she get in? I creaked the door open slowly, ready to run back to the police at any moment. Sarah? Sarah! I called into the house, hearing it echo down the dark and empty hallways. What are you doing in here? My voice trailed off. What the hell was I doing? I needed to run, and run now. My mind screamed at me. As a wind gust shrieked outside and blasted me with cold air, I watched the dim moonlight dance through the empty rooms of the house. If Sarah was inside, she didn't say anything, and her silence continued as the wind howled and the house groaned. Thump, thump, thump. Something was beginning to roll down the stairs from the top. Something heavy. From my position, I could only see the base of the stairs, so I could only listen as the sound grew closer and louder. Then it happened. A pale, mangled form came tumbling down the last few steps and smashed onto the ground. Its limbs horribly twisted and broken. Crimson globs speckled the soiled ground where it now lay. Its arms and legs seemed to radiate a ghastly white, splayed out like a spider on the shadowy ground. Heavy blood oozed from it silently in the darkness. It had no head. Then I could make out footsteps. My body was frozen, my heart spasming erratically. I couldn't take my eyes off the corpse. I eventually heard Sarah's voice quietly echoing down the stairs. You didn't give me time to prepare this one like the others. I tried to say something, but nothing came out. Not even a squeak. After all, you said he was special to you, she continued, coming into view, hacksaw in one hand and a ghoulish head in the other. Its expression was so distorted in terror that I didn't immediately recognize it as Max's. His mouth was stretched horribly agape, almost as if unhinged, a horrific scream forever imprinted on his face as his eyes stared straight ahead, wide and unblinking. I couldn't take the sight of it. I fell to the ground in utter shock. I tried to scream in anguish, but as before, I couldn't make a sound and simply dry heaved into my hands. Then I felt a hand on my shoulder. There, Sarah cooed. Are you feeling sick? Did you catch a cold? Sarah will make John all better, and John will love Sarah for it." She gently lifted me to my feet, dropping Max's head and the hacksaw, and in turn grabbing my hands. I was in shock, no doubt. My limbs felt numb and distant. I couldn't think, I couldn't move. I was just standing there, shaking violently. She gave me a big hug, wrapping herself around me and smiling crookedly. Her movements were all wrong, disturbingly inhuman, as if she were a puppet controlling her own strings. Her blue eyes should have been highlighted by the dark crimson blood splattered on the floor, and yet they appeared just as gray as her skin, sinking into her face, enclosed by the darkness. Her frigid hand slowly grabbed mine again, and she began leading me up the stairs, making sweet noises and whispering. "Shh, it's okay. All you need is me." I followed in a trance-like state, not really processing anything, stuck on the horrors I had just seen. Max's disfigured head, his broken body, tumbling down the stairs like a rag doll. The bus, the bodies everywhere. Next thing I knew, I was on my bed with Sarah sitting close next to me, holding my hands in her lap, her face a contorted, grinning mess. "It's cold in here, you know," she said, blushing as her eyes remained dull and lifeless. "Maybe if you just held me." I managed to choke out 2 words. "My friends." My eyes began watering. "Shh," she swooned, maneuvering to sit on top of me. "John's friends are all here." I shook my head. "Mrs. Bus Driver Lady is over there," she assured me, pointing to a mangled, bloody mess in the dark corner of my room. Through my bleary vision, I could make out a ghastly set of eyes staring lifelessly ahead from within the mound of flesh. The sight was horrendous, and I turned my head away, gagging some more. "You don't need anyone but me," she continued. "But I didn't want John getting lonely either, so I kept your friends here." She began stroking my hair. "Most of Jenna is in your closet. I cut a hole in your roof so she could stay there for longer." Sarah giggled. "Room temperature is no good for friends. It must be cold like outside. I've let her be here with you all week. It's my turn now." I began thrashing around, trying to scream but only letting out strangled squeaks. I couldn't take any more of this. She giggled and interlaced her fingers with mine, pinning my arms down and bringing her face inches away, grinning from ear to ear. Her head was tilted to one side, her dull gray eyes swirling with darkness. "Only me to love now," she whispered. "John loves me now." I shook my head violently. "No," I croaked out. "You're so funny. John loves me, and I love John. So much." She leaned her forehead against mine. "Much more than his parents. His parents wanted to leave him, but I made them stay with John. Made them stay." Her hand moved and gestured under my bed. Then, she kissed me. I just couldn't believe it. It was her. The woman of my dreams was standing just 10 feet away at the copy machine, staring at me. Me, of all people. Her hair was red and her eyes were blue. She was the true mock-up of an angel if there ever were one. She had never noticed me before, yet here I was, minding my own business, and now she was staring at me. Some may have called her stare a disturbed and angry one, but I could tell that she felt the same way about me as I did for her. Sure, I may have been staring at her first, and that may be what caught her attention, but I could see the yearning in her eyes. She wanted me. For months, I had watched her from the safety of my small but quaint cubicle. I knew every detail about her life. Every single one. I knew when she had lunch, who her friends were, who she talked to, who she liked and disliked, and where she would be at any given moment of the workday. I even knew where she and her husband lived, as she and I both took the same bus to work. I didn't own a vehicle, and her husband took their car to his place of employment every morning. Even on the long bus ride to work, she never so much as batted an eye in my direction. But today was different. This was my chance. I smiled at her as she made a somewhat protruded facial expression towards me. Then she looked away in a seemingly disgusted motion. Love is a strange mistress. My mind was now racing with an unending plethora of emotions, coupled with large quantities of dopamine. My synapses were firing off at an alarming rate as I stood up and started walking to the copy machine. I felt such a strong need to reach out and touch her. Just before I took my final step in her direction, my boss came over and pulled her aside to discuss some work-related issues. My march was impeded, but the ever-growing desire in me remained constant. I needed to see her. Although we went to work at the same time, she always left an hour before I did, just in time to catch the last bus. I would usually have a coworker bring me home. Sometimes in the summer, I would even travel by bicycle. Right now, however, it was the middle of winter, and there was a storm coming tonight. A very big one. I would have to find a ride to my house. By the time I finally punched out, my emotions were haywire with a reckless sense of longing. I truly had to see her again. She was waiting for me. I could just feel it in each and every one of my eager bones. I had to see her now. I didn't even bother to ask anyone for a ride home. I just walked out of the building and started heading towards her house. I knew the route by heart. I didn't have a jacket or a hat, but I was warm. It must have been love. What else could it have been? Surely it wasn't my button-up, short-sleeved shirt or my tie. I know it wasn't my khaki pants. It must have been love. I had a warm sweater of love to keep me safe from the bitter, cold air of winter. I was not only warm, but elated at the same time. I was going to march all the way to her house so we could finally be together. My plan was perfect, much as she was. I guessed that it would take me 3 hours to get to her house, as she lived roughly 10.5 miles from work. With this in mind, I made long and firm strides in the hopes of minimizing the amount of time it would take me to reach her. While walking down Main Street in this fashion, I noticed a lot of the shops closing up for the night due to the approaching blizzard. One of these shops was the local florist. An idea sprang into my aroused mind. I couldn't show up at her house empty-handed. That just wouldn't be right. I needed a gift, one that would profess my love for her in material form. I needed a rose. I pushed the door open as the florist was about to lock up. I startled the hell out of her. I grabbed the nearest rose I could find, threw some money down on the counter, and left in a haste. I had a mission after all. I started power walking towards her house once again, hoping I would beat the storm there. Before making it too far, I felt a sharp pain in my hand. I looked down and saw droplets of blood spattered across the ground. It was the rose. I must have grabbed an uncut one, thorns and all. My palm was now bleeding profusely, but I kept walking. It was merely a wound received while attending to affairs of the heart. I was focused on the bigger picture. I trudged through harsh winds, my pace never wavering. I could tell the storm was coming. I was now maybe a quarter of the way there. It was then that I felt snow. It began falling at a swift and steady rate, making it almost impossible to see in front of me. Still, I pressed on. My love for this woman was insatiable and desirous. I needed her. I absolutely needed her. I walked and walked, feeling the sting of the snow on my bare face. After an hour or so, I noticed a mark on my arm. It was beginning to turn black. This was the onset of frostbite, I guessed. This in no way slowed me down. I still had my sweater of love keeping me warm every step of the way. I neither felt the chill in my arm, nor did I care about the risk to my health. I had made up my mind, and it couldn't be altered, not by a human or by the frozen forces of Mother Nature herself. My arm became blacker and blacker as I walked. My other arm started becoming discolored too. I could only assume my face was as well. This did not bother me in the slightest. I only cared about the task at hand. As the gusts of wind turned harsher, I clenched the rose harder with my now gray hand. I was determined, more so than I had ever been. After another long and treacherous hour, I finally arrived at her street. This was it. My love would finally be reciprocated. I could hardly contain my excitement as I made my way over to her house. Luckily, her husband wasn't home yet. The lawn was covered in snow, but I could still see the stone walkway leading the way to the front door. I took a step onto it, but quickly fell to the ground, slipping on a sheet of ice. I landed on my arm. I didn't feel anything, but I'm sure that I broke it, as I couldn't move it one bit. I stood up and kept walking, calling out to her as I did. I hoped that she would hear my shrieks and come running out to see me. Just then, the front door to her house opened, and she walked out, proving my cries to be effective. She said nothing. She simply looked at me with the most frightened look I had ever seen. She raised her hand over her mouth in shock of what she was witnessing. I reached up and presented her the rose. My voice was tired from yelling her name, but I managed to offer her a couple of words. "For you." She stared at me for a second, just as she did earlier at work. Those eyes of disgust, that look of confusion. It was now turning into sheer terror. Love truly is a strange mistress. Before I could speak again, she began to scream. She screamed so loudly, in fact, that I felt a sharp pain in my ears. This was the first time I had felt any pain at all during the long and arduous day. The second pain I would feel would be in my heart. I could tell that she was terrified of me. I may have looked odd and disfigured, but my love for her remained intact. Why couldn't she see this? Why was she doing this to me? How could she? Rage began to overcome my emotions. I couldn't handle the unrequited mess that had just been thrown directly in front of me. I could now feel the bitter coldness of the storm. I was now aware of my frostbitten skin as well. The immense amount of emotional and physical pain I felt at this moment caused me to lash out at my one true love. Using my good arm, I took the rose, thorns and all, and started beating her with it. I slashed open every inch of beautiful skin that I could see. As the blood dripped from her defenseless body, she screamed once again. I kept slashing at her skin, over and over again, but she wouldn't stop. The sound of her voice pierced through the cold night as well as my ears. With one last swipe, I sliced open her throat with the rose. She finally stopped. Her lifeless body fell to the snowy ground. I laid down with her, trying to provide her with some warmth. She looked so faultless, so attractive. Her beauty was staggering, even after death. I smiled, happy that there was no longer screaming, happy that I had provided her with inner peace. She could now rest. We both could. I placed the bloody rose in between us and let our bodies envelop it. I looked at her eyes once more before closing mine. Maybe now we could finally be together.